Some debts don't get paid in cash. Some get paid in people. Nadia had known this since she was 12 years old, sitting in the back of her stepfather's truck while he explained, calmly and without looking at her, that life was a ledger. Everything balanced eventually. She just hadn't known, back then, that she was the column he'd been cooking. She found out on a Wednesday. Wednesdays were supposed to be ordinary. She had a shift at the cannery from 6 to 2. Then she'd pick up the books for her stepfather's dry goods business. Not because he paid her, but because if she didn't, the numbers would be wrong. And when the numbers were wrong, Gerald drank. And when Gerald drank, the furniture moved in ways furniture wasn't supposed to. So she did the books. She had been doing the books since she was 14. She was 26 now, and she still had not figured out how to charge him for it. She came home that afternoon to find 2 men she didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table. They weren't the kind of men you found in a place like Kellerton. Kellerton was all cracked asphalt and aluminum siding, and the particular grey that came from a river town that had been waiting for something to save it since the mills closed. These men had the look of people who had never waited for anything. Their suits were dark, their hands were still. They didn't turn when she came in the door, which was somehow worse than if they had. Gerald was at the counter. He wasn't drinking, which meant he was scared, which meant Nadia was already 2 steps behind. "Nadia." He said her name the way you'd refer to a line item. She set her bag down slowly. "Who are these men, Gerald?" It wasn't a question. She'd learned years ago not to phrase things as questions around him. Questions gave him room to lie. One of the men looked up. He had a face that was difficult to read and clearly had been designed that way. "Miss Nadia Reyes?" "That depends," she said. "On what follows. It follows," the man said, "that you've been sold." She heard the words. She processed them the way you process a number that doesn't balance, turning it over, checking the column, confirming that yes, it did say what you thought it said. Then she looked at Gerald. He was looking at the window. "Sold," she said. "Your stepfather borrowed a significant sum from our employer 3 years ago. The debt has accumulated. In lieu of cash repayment, he offered—" The man paused, glanced at a small card in his hand. "Collateral of a personal nature. Collateral of a personal nature." She was 26 years old. She had done every set of books in this house since she was a teenager. She had absorbed every shortfall, every gap, every number that didn't add up, and somewhere in there, Gerald had borrowed money from people whose suits cost more than this kitchen, and he had listed her as the thing he'd hand over if he couldn't pay. She thought about hitting him. She thought about it calmly, and specifically the way she thought about most things. Then she thought about the 2 men at the table and the probability that hitting Gerald would not, in this particular situation, improve her position. "How much?" she said. "I'm sorry, the debt. How much is it?" The man's expression didn't change. "That's not information, that. If you're going to tell me I'm being used to settle a debt, I'd like to know the number I'm settling." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Humor me." A pause. Then he said a number. She didn't let her face move. Inside, something that had been tightly coiled in her chest for 12 years snapped quietly in half. "When?" she said. "Tonight." She looked at Gerald one more time. He was still looking at the window. She wondered if he could feel her watching him. She wondered if he felt anything at all. "Fine," she said. "I'll need 20 minutes." She went to her room and she packed the same bag she had been mentally packing since she was 17. The things she actually needed took up less space than most people would assume. Her notebooks, 3 of them, filled with the shorthand accounting system she'd developed herself because Gerald's records were a disaster. Her mother's ring, which Gerald had never managed to pawn because she'd hidden it inside a hollowed-out can of tomato paste at the back of the pantry. Some cash she'd skimmed, dollar by dollar, from the household grocery budget over 4 years. A change of clothes. She did not look around the room before she left. There was nothing in it she was going to miss. The drive was 2 hours. Nobody spoke to her. The second man drove. The first man sat in the passenger seat and looked at his phone. Nadia sat in the back and watched the landscape change, from the particular flatness of Kellerton to hills, then tree lines, then a road that wound up through something that looked like countryside, but was maintained with too much precision to be natural. When they turned through a gate and she saw the house, she understood at a physical level that she had misjudged the size of the thing she had walked into. It wasn't a mansion in the way you saw in movies. It was older than that, and quieter. Stone that had gone dark with weather. Windows that reflected nothing. The kind of structure that didn't need to announce itself because it had been there long enough to simply be a fact of the landscape. They brought her inside. A woman met them in the hall. 50s, silver hair pulled back, the expression of someone who had organized every difficult thing this house had ever seen and would continue to do so until she was physically prevented. "Miss Reyes," the woman said. She had a slight accent Nadia couldn't place. "I'm Vera. I manage the household. Come with me." They gave her a room that was nicer than any room she'd ever slept in, which made her trust it less. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands and tried to think clearly. Facts. She was here. Gerald had sold her. She did not know the full scope of what that meant. She had not been harmed. She had been spoken to by people who seemed to expect her to comply, and she had complied, because compliance was not the same as surrender, and she had learned a long time ago that you didn't spend your leverage before you understood the board. She'd meet him in the morning, Vera had said. She hadn't said his name. She slept less than she expected to. The bed was too quiet. His name was Calloway. She learned that from a letter on the desk in her room, which turned out to be a standard contract, which was so unexpected that she read it 3 times before she accepted that it was real. It outlined in clean legal language that she was being brought into the household in a capacity that was formally described as administrative assistant, that she would be housed and compensated, that she was not to contact her previous household or discuss the terms of her arrangement with outside parties. It was signed at the bottom with a name and a date. Calloway. She didn't know the name. She should have been relieved. She wasn't. She met him that morning in a room that was clearly an office, but had been furnished like someone had tried to make it look like it wasn't. Dark wood, maps on the walls, not decorative, annotated, a desk that was covered in papers arranged with a precision that told her whoever worked here understood that chaos in paperwork was the kind of thing that got people killed. He was standing with his back to her when she came in, looking at something on the wall, tall. The kind of build that came from actual use, not vanity. When he turned, she saw the scar that ran along the left side of his jaw, the grey at his temples, the eyes that moved across her like she was a problem he was calculating the dimensions of. "Miss Reyes," he said. "Not a question. Sit down." "I'll stand," she said. For now, a pause. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a recalibration of some kind. "Suit yourself." He moved to the desk and sat. He picked up a folder. "Your stepfather owes me $240,000. He's been unable to pay. He offered you as a collateral of a personal nature," she said. "Yes, I was there." He looked up. "I read the contract," she added. "The one you left on my desk. I have some questions about Clause 7. Clause 7. It specifies that I'm prohibited from disclosing the terms of my arrangement, but doesn't define what counts as disclosure. That's vague enough to be a liability in either direction, and I'd like it clarified before I sign anything." The silence stretched out long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence. "You do bookkeeping," he said finally. "Among other things." "What other things?" "Inventory, supply chain reconciliation, audit trail reconstruction, specifically the kind where someone has been deliberately obscuring the trail. I've been cleaning up Gerald's records for 12 years. Gerald was not subtle." She folded her hands. "I assume your operation is more complex than Gerald's dry goods business. I assume it's also less clean on paper, or you wouldn't have Clause 7. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not going to let it make decisions for me." She did not understand in those first weeks what she had walked into. She understood it in pieces. The house ran like a machine that had been engineered over a long time to run quietly. There were men who came and went at hours that weren't business hours. There were conversations that stopped when she entered rooms and resumed at a lower register when she left. There were rooms she was not taken to, which she noted without comment. Vera showed her the accounts on her third day, the legitimate ones. Nadia sat with them for 4 hours and came back with a list of 14 discrepancies. Vera stared at the list. These were filed by our previous accountant. They were filed badly. Nadia set the papers down. The amounts are small enough that they wouldn't trigger an audit. But the pattern is consistent across 18 months, which means either your previous accountant was incompetent or he was skimming. He's no longer with us, Vera said, in a tone that strongly implied a particular meaning for that phrase. Right, Nadia said. Well, the pattern is still there. I'd recommend correcting it before anyone with authority looks at the filings. She went back to her room that evening and sat with her notebooks and tried to map what she could see against what she couldn't. The structure of the operation was visible in the edges of things, in the accounts that existed and what moved through them, in the names that appeared in correspondence, in the particular way that certain shipments were described in the ledgers versus how they were described in the supplementary logs. She was not naive. She knew, broadly, what she was looking at. She had known what Gerald was borrowing money from, and who from for years. She'd just never been inside it before. The question was what she was going to do about it. She learned him slowly, the way you learned a building you were going to have to live in, by its habits, by what it did under pressure, by which parts of it were solid, and which parts were held together with older repairs. Calloway was not what she'd expected. She had built him in her head during the drive here, had assembled him from the things she knew about men who held that kind of power, and the man she'd assembled was the wrong shape. He didn't perform authority. He had it the way some people had height. It was just a fact about him that he didn't think about. He spoke in short sentences. He didn't explain himself. He started calling her into the office in the mornings. At first it was questions about the accounts. Specific questions, detailed questions, the kind that told her he already understood what he was looking at and was testing whether she did too. She answered them without decoration. He seemed to prefer that. Then the questions shifted. Supply chain problems, a route that had gone unreliable, a specific logistics gap he was trying to close without creating a paper trail that could be read in one direction. She worked through the numbers while he watched and offered what she found without editorializing, and he took what she gave him and made decisions she couldn't always follow but which, in retrospect, usually turned out to have been the right ones. "You're not what I expected," he said one afternoon. It was raining. He'd been working through something on the maps, and she'd been recrossing a set of figures at the other end of the desk. She didn't look up. "What did you expect?" "Someone Gerald would hand over." She let that sit for a moment. Gerald handed over the most useful thing in his operation, and he didn't know it. "That's Gerald." Calloway looked at her. She went back to the figures. "You're not angry," he said. "I'm angry," she said. "I've just been angry for 12 years. It doesn't stop me from working then." "What do you want for a Reyes?" "Right now, I want these figures to balance." "Long term?" She set down her pen. "I want to not be a liability in someone else's ledger." He didn't say anything, but something in the room shifted like a calculation had been completed, and the result was unexpected. The trouble came from the north. She heard it first in the change in the house, a tightening, a particular quality of alertness that she had learned to read the way she read numbers. Men who had been moving slowly moved quickly. Conversations she couldn't hear happened behind closed doors. Calloway was absent for 2 days, and when he came back, there was something different in the set of his shoulders that she recognized from the worst nights in Gerald's house. The look of a man who had been somewhere hard and was trying to bring himself back. She found out through Vera that a supplier in the north had decided to sell a debt. Not his debt. A debt that contained, among other things, information about Calloway's operation, about its structure, its routes, its accounts, about Nadia. That was the part that stopped her. She went to Calloway's office that evening without being called. He was sitting at the desk. The maps had been cleared. He had a glass in front of him that was mostly untouched, which told her more than if he'd been drinking it. "They know I'm here," she said. He looked up. "Not as an accountant," she said. "As leverage. Gerald didn't just sell me to settle his debt. He told someone else what he was doing and why, which means there's a second party who knows your operation had a vulnerability and what it is." She sat down across from him. "I'm the liability. You're not Calloway." She said his name the way she'd been saying numbers for 12 years. Precisely, without heat. "I know how to read a ledger. Right now I'm in yours on the wrong side." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The information they have is incomplete." "How incomplete?" "Enough that it's usable, not enough that it's accurate." He leaned back. "The accounts you've been working on, the corrections you made." She understood immediately. "The corrections changed the trail. The information they have is 18 months old. It points at routes that no longer exist and accounts that have been restructured." He paused. "You did that without knowing you were doing it." She sat with that. "Or I did it because it was the right fix, and you let me do it without telling me why you needed it done that way." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. Close enough to be interesting. "Both," he said. "That's not honesty, Calloway." "No," he said. "It's operational security." She should have been angry. She catalogued the anger, set it aside, and stayed with the problem. "So what they have is a map of something that doesn't exist anymore. That's useful to you. But they don't know it's useless yet." "No, and when they find out, they'll try to get the current picture." "Yes. From me, they'll try." She looked at her hands. They were the hands of someone who had been doing numbers since she was a child. Ink-stained when she used the old pens, steadier than most people's hands because she had spent years making sure she did not shake around Gerald. They looked like ordinary hands. They were, apparently, the most dangerous thing in this office. "What do you need?" she said. "I need you to let me move you to the secondary house for 3 weeks. I need you to continue working on the accounts remotely, and I need you to trust that I'm going to handle the northern situation before it becomes your problem. And if I don't trust that, then I'll tell you exactly what I'm planning to do about it, and you can tell me if the logic holds." She blinked. That was not what she'd expected him to say. "You do that," she said. "You check my numbers," he said. "This is a number." The 3 weeks at the secondary house were the strangest of her life. It was smaller than the main house. A place in the hills, staffed by 2 people she didn't know and didn't try to. She had her notebooks, she had the remote access to the accounts that Vera had set up on a secured line. She worked 8 hours a day, and thought for the remaining hours, and tried to figure out what she was becoming. She had been somebody's liability her whole life. Gerald's burden, his backup plan, the thing he reached for when everything else had failed. She had absorbed that so completely that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. She had made herself useful because useful things didn't get thrown out, even when they got handed over. Calloway was the first person who had asked her what she wanted. She was still thinking about that. He sent messages through Vera. Daily, terse, informational, a practice that she understood was not emotional, but was also, she realized slowly, a form of accounting. He was telling her what she needed to know to do her work. He was treating the information like a resource that she was owed. She started responding with questions. He answered them. On the 19th day, she sent a message through Vera that said, "The Northern Supplier's route structure has a gap in it. The gap has been there for at least 2 years. If they're trying to rebuild leverage from scratch, they'll hit that gap and have to choose between 2 options. Neither option benefits them. I'd like to show you why, if you have an hour." He came to the secondary house the next day. They worked through it together at the kitchen table, which was smaller than his desk, which meant they were closer than they usually were, which she catalogued and set aside. He saw what she saw in the numbers. He asked questions that improved her analysis. She told him so. He looked faintly startled, which she found more interesting than she should have. "You're going to be fine," she said at the end, looking at the maps they'd marked up. "We," he said. She looked at him. "We're going to be fine," he said. "You're in this too." She thought about the contract on her desk. the clause 7 she'd flagged on her first morning. She thought about what it meant to stop being collateral and start being something that had chosen to be present. "Yes," she said, "we are." The northern situations resolved itself in the way that these things apparently resolved. Not with a single event, but with a pressure that built until it broke in a direction that left Calloway's operation intact, and the northern supplier with a set of problems that were entirely self-created. She heard about it the way she heard about most things in this world, through the numbers, through the accounts that reflected, in their movement, the outcomes she couldn't observe directly. She came back to the main house on a Tuesday. Gerald called her that same week. She had forgotten that he had her number. She didn't answer the first time. She stood in the kitchen of Calloway's house and listened to the voicemail, which was Gerald explaining that he hoped she was well and that he wanted to let her know that things had worked out and he was grateful, and he hoped there were no hard feelings. She played it twice. Then she called Vera. "I need a favor," she said. "Of course, Gerald's business accounts. I need to make sure they're being monitored." She paused. "And I need to make sure that if anything irregular comes to light, any discrepancy, any outstanding obligation, the appropriate parties are informed immediately. I'll let Mr. Calloway know you called." "Thank you," she said. She didn't feel satisfied, exactly. She had expected satisfaction, the clean click of a thing balancing out that she'd been waiting 12 years for. What she felt instead was something quieter, like a number you've been carrying in your head for so long you stop noticing its weight, and then one day you write it down and close the book, and it is just a number, not a thing that belongs to you anymore. She signed the contract 6 weeks later. She had negotiated Clause 7 herself, had sat across from Calloway's lawyer and explained, in precise terms, what the language meant and why it needed to be tightened. And the lawyer had looked at her, and then at Calloway, and Calloway had said, simply, "She's right, fix it." The new contract was 15 pages. She had read every word of it. She had marked up 3 of the pages, and she had gotten every mark agreed to. She was not collateral anymore. She was on the right side of the ledger. She was standing on the steps outside on the afternoon she signed, looking out at the grounds. The stone of the drive, the tree line, the sky that had gone the particular pale gold of a fall evening when Calloway came and stood beside her. "You look like you're calculating something," he said. "I'm always calculating something." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the house breathed in the way it did in the evenings, a settling, a slowing of the machinery. "Are you planning to stay?" he said. It was not quite a question. "That depends," she said. "On what?" She turned and looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, at the eyes that still moved over everything like they were solving for variables. He was, she had decided, the most honest person she had ever known, not because he told the whole truth, but because he never told lies she'd later need to undo. He operated in a world that ran on fear and leverage and the particular math of who owed what to whom, and he had looked at her, the thing someone had handed over to settle a debt, and he had asked her what she wanted. Nobody had ever asked her that before. "On whether you actually need a bookkeeper," she said, "or whether you need someone who understands how the whole system works." He looked at her for a long moment. "Second one," he said. She turned back to the tree line. The gold was deepening. Somewhere in the accounts she'd been running for the past month, a particular set of numbers had finally balanced. A gap she'd been chasing through 4 years of Gerald's bad records, closed at last, clean and exact and permanent. She had spent her whole life being the thing someone was going to spend eventually. She had been handed over and written down and moved from one column to another without anyone asking her permission, or her opinion or even her name. She knew, now, what it felt like to be the one holding the ledger. She didn't plan on giving it back.